Keith Go, I'm the principal, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this 50th anniversary of the MCR. Now, I look back at where the MCR started, and like everything in Telly Hall, there's a bit of an argument over things, you know, so was it this, was it that, and so on. But the magazines which we digitized and put online tell us, and I spoke to Alan Bowers, who was the first MCR president, that really, although there was an attempt a year or so earlier to get an MCR started, it was that 65, 66 period, which was brought about really by politics. A lot of the influence in Oxford was at that time, was really the Franks Commission, which was looking at the way that Oxford was organised. I think we probably still need another Franks Commission today, 50 years on. Just even to ask the question about, is it even organised today? But what the Franks Commission was doing was looking at the whole structure of Oxford and its governance. And part of that was the business of these graduate students, because there's really no societies for the graduate students at that time in many colleges. And colleges, although they had associations, there's little organisational structure. And Frank's Commission really looked at the issue that undoubtedly this university, like all the other British universities, were going to see a big increase in the number of graduate students, and therefore some structure was needed. And so Telly Hall took the initiative there and formed the Middle Common Room, and the physicality of it was the hiring of 7 Longwall Street from Maudley, which is where the MCR started. I've met people who were there, and I've heard the stories about, you know, ropes out of windows, and the fact that although now we celebrate the fact that there's lots of, and the ropes were for, I think, delivering females into the hall and drunkards out of the hall in those terms. But now we celebrate the fact that we have a mixed academic community here. I looked at that report by Alan Bowers for the 1965 magazine. Social functions have been limited because of renovation work on the house, the 7 Longwall Street, because a common room, a kitchen, and a small dining room and a writing room were being put into the place. But fortnightly dinners were held in the Emden room, introduced in the Trinity term. More ambitious athletic projects were also developed. Athletic projects. An MCR 8 and a bar billiards team. But it didn't seem as if they sort of went too well. But they did hold a successful croquet match with a ladies' college. Now, I'm not sure you can write this these days, but I'll read you what it says. Narrowly and diplomatically lost. Now, I suspect that they were trounced. I suspect they were absolutely trounced by whichever ladies' college it was. But anyway, Alan can't be with us today. He lives in Hull. His wife's rather ill, but sent his regards. He actually reflected, not sure how he ever became the first president of the MCR. He thinks it was because at some point he left his hand up when others went down in a conversation. And that's probably what might have happened to some of the presidents arrayed before you. But really, what I want to do is welcome you very warmly, and there's going to be a very grand dinner tonight. And I think we'll just have conversations during the day. We'll hear some reflections, we'll hear some interesting talks, and I'm going to thank particularly Kate and Philippa and Judith Beresford from the Development Office. Judith's an alumna herself, but has come back to help me with development work here, and then Catherine and Claire in terms of just all of the work that they've done. And then this amazing thing, which is to actually get the weather like this today. Because I left Beijing, I got in last night from Beijing, doing some fundraising for the hall there, and setting up relationships for our students. and it was absolutely pissing down in Beijing, and it was pissing down in London when I got here as well. So my heart stopped, and I thought, good God. But when I saw Kate last night, she said, don't worry, it's all going to be fine. So it's all going to be fine because we're now going to move on to let you hear some reflections from the MCR Presidents over the decades, the 5 decades. We're going to hear them in, I always like to say that when I hear Gordies or attend Gordies where people come back to the hall after a number of years, my comment to people is this is a bloody great story. It's a great story that I like as a principal to hear now. Stories like this are for principals 40 years later. When they happen, they're for deans. Principals don't want to hear about what goes on in the hall at the moment, right? That's for deans to deal with. So there's no possibility that a principal could chair the reflections of some students at the hall. So we've given that to Michael Hill, and he definitely knows how to keep a team in order. He can tell you something about that another time, or maybe now. But anyway, Michael, it's all over to you.
Thank you, Keith.
Let me.
Fellow Valerians and guests, welcome back to the hall, which in many ways is a very different SEH than when I came up in 1968 and also when I was in the MCR in 71. Just to give you a working format today, what I'd like to do is each of the contributors will give their reflections, and then I'm sure that some of you, it's going to be a very informal day, and even in this structure we can be very informal. You might add to the jollity of the occasion by maybe giving us the benefit of some of your experiences and anecdotes when you were at the hall. However, even though I came up into the MCR in 71, in my perspective, the hall still retains very much of its best features. The ability to accommodate diverse personalities in a friendly and supportive environment, and to produce characters with the confidence to make a difference in whatever their chosen field. So I will leave you with some fine examples of the products of the college and the MCR. And first of all, I will introduce Nick Boucher. Nick.
Thank you, Michael. If I don't use the mic, can you hear me at the back? Yes. Yeah. Right. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming to this rather curious event, and I hope I helped to make it worthwhile. In my case, it's actually 53 years since I came up to the hall, and 50 years since I became eligible for the Middle Common Room, which was the year it actually started. Nevertheless, I should do my best to recall what happened. To show how long ago this was, in my first year, Magdalen had booked an unknown Liverpool band for their summer ball. Between the booking and the event, the band had issued a #1 single. I think it was Please Please Me. And of course they never fulfilled their commitment. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you who they were. It's a cliche that things were very different in the olden days. The biggest single difference is that there were no women in hall, or indeed in any of what were then known as the men's colleges. Women came up only to the 5 women's colleges. The domestic arrangements in hall, and doubtless in every one of the men's colleges, were consequently crude. Communal washing facilities existed in some staircases and in the best building, but they were frequently awash, and put one in mind of the second coming of Noah. I just can't remember what we did about taking a bath. It must have been possible to take a bath, for God's sake, but I don't know what we did. Another consequence of the absence of women was an intensely masculine atmosphere. This was intensified at the Hall by the preponderance of very high quality sportsmen amongst the undergraduates. I don't know how this came about, but it seems probable that the Hall was trying to make a name for itself as a fully fledged Oxford college at the time, having, we only got our charter, I think, in 1958. This was particularly evident in rowing and football, where the 8 and the 15 could have beaten any team in the land, and sometimes did. This was, of course, before the age of most professional sport. It was said that Joe McPartlin, who just won the Scottish cap, couldn't get into the college rugby team because they claimed they had 2 better centres. I don't know if that's true. There used to be a tanker donated by the 11 members of the Hall currently in residence who participated in the Rome Olympics in 1960. I don't know if the Hall has it still. All this came out of a very small hall, much smaller than it is now. We had the front quad, a hinterland behind that past the bursary office where Tom Crabb, the college gardener, had his horticultural headquarters. And there was the Best building. The library occupied some rooms on the first floor of the Best building, and that was all there was. The atmosphere was febrile and rumbustious, particularly after cuppas suppers, which were frequent until they were banned when a number of the participants threw their late evening beer glasses onto the roof of the building on the north side of the quad, breaking some of the Stonesfield slates and causing a lethal rain of debris onto the crowds below. I shrink from thinking what the established SCR thought of it all. The principal, John Kelly, with his clear-sighted determination that the Hall should grow and develop, Richard Farger, Rowley Gullick, David Scargill, Francis Rossotti, who admitted me and who said to me years later, well, we all make mistakes sometimes. My doctoral supervisor, Jack Christian, and the renowned English faculty trio, Graham Midgley, Reggie Alton, and Bruce Mitchell, and others, frankly, must have spent as little time in Hall as they decently could. Actually, the principal and Rowley Gullick were widely thought to enjoy the proximity of the sportsmen. All this changed during my time up. Part of the change was an increase in the number of graduate students. The Hall was effectively closed to graduates during vacations because it was used for conferences, and the needs of the graduates were increasingly felt. The MCR was started in 7 Longbourn Street, as Keith told us, an ordinary residential house converted to student accommodation upstairs and a kitchen and general living room downstairs. The living room contained a television, which the founding fathers of the SCR, being of a Puritan and authoritarian mindset, had fitted with a slot machine, so that those who wished to watch the thing had to pay for the privilege. A motion was unsurprisingly put forward at my first MCR meeting to remove this coin box. It passed. The SCR, itself growing rapidly, nominated one of its new and younger members to keep a watchful eye on us. This was Ken Seagar, now presumably emeritus, who was a great help to me in those formative days. The main function of the SCR in those early days was to provide a place for lunch. We were catered for by a splendid Irish lady who provided hot pies, rolls, butter and cheese and fruit and yogurt. I can't remember how we paid for it, but we did. Among the regular users were my fellow metallurgist Derek Statham, David Goodwin, Peter Dixon, Tommy Bedford, Simon Gattrell, Jeff Osborne, and Ian. Many others, and if you were among them I haven't mentioned you, I'm sorry, you know who you are. There was a supply of bottled and canned beer in the kitchen, which was available on the trust system. It was a happy place. Everybody had their own specialism, and people went back to work, to lunch, to their own work. The last thing before we disbanded to our desks was a compulsory viewing Trumpton, which came on at 1:45. I can still remember the names of the firemen: Pugh, Barney McGrew, Cuthbert, Diggle and Grass. As the Hall grew and expanded and developed, the JCR was given new premises and the MCR moved into what had been the JCR, but that happened later. I'm sure that the current MCR is a much more responsible and sedate place than it was 15 years ago. As an early occasion as an officer of the MCR, I was asked to give a speech well, demanded would be a better description, because the request was accompanied by banging of tables and so on. Obviously I prepared nothing and was a bit stumped, but I got by with the device of ad-libbing a letter from the bursar complaining about the excessively boisterous behaviour of some of the MCR members. To their credit, those offenders knew who they were and enjoyed the lampoon as much as anybody. My suggestion that the JCR should be open, the MCR should be open to JCR members during vacations, however, was not so well received, but it turned out that there was no demand anyway. Looking back over my own extended stay at the Hall, I am above all grateful that it enabled me to grow up slowly and finally to start work with a bit of a carapace to defend myself against an outside world which didn't set much store by qualifications. I have had the opportunity to fall into the river, to fall in love, to fall into bad company, to fall out mildly with the authorities, but ultimately to fall on my feet. I shall always be grateful for the Hall's patience and for the many happy memories that I carry with me. Glorious Allah.
Thank you, Nick. Nick was here when I arrived, and I think he must have done much of the groundwork which I benefited from. The next person on the panel is Ian Robertson. Ian?
Thank you, Mike. Well, I too have to ask in advance for your forgiveness if I misremember, embellish, or even exaggerate. The last time I spoke to a hall gathering like this was at a cuppers dinner in the old dining hall. The hall had won cuppers in rugby, hockey and football, and to mark the achievement, the principal convened a joint event. After the meal, the rugby captain spoke first, then the captain of hockey. By the time I stood up, I was bored and everybody else was bored. Unfortunately for me, the rugby club at their table up there in the gallery in the old dining hall had squirreled away some bread rolls, and I did not get very far. So if you think that I've developed a serious twitch this morning, it's only a phantom bread roll. 1968. The apogee of the swinging 60s, demonstrations against the Vietnam War, student riots. They had barely cleaned up the streets of Paris when I became MCR President. How was Oxford affected by those events? It was no King's Road, basically because, as Nick has pointed out, Oxford lacked the female dimension. I came here from St Andrews, where women made up 51% of the student community. And I thought Oxford a very strange and unbalanced society. As for politics, the Hall set up a college council to stave off any unrest by establishing formal arrangements for mutual consultation. But the only unrest I ever came across was a plot by some Hall people to nab Tariq Ali from the steps of the Clarendon building where he was making a speech and dump him in time-honoured fashion in the Mercury Fountain in Christchurch. However, nothing actually transpired. I don't remember how I came to be elected as MCR President. I succeeded Nick, who was a hard act to follow, having been here man and boy. But there were no terms of reference, so I asked members what they expected of me. They wanted a regular MCR hop, as discos were called in those days. Easy enough, but I was expected to find the female counterparties without whom the disco would be pointless. This was always a big procurement exercise. Contact with women's colleges, which was never effective, the Hall not having much of a reputation for its social graces, phone calls to nurses' homes and secretarial colleges, networking among local sixth formers.
Delete that for the record.
But true. Mostly, however, I failed. And fortunately, my memory now blocks out just how miserable these discos must have been. The monthly MCR dinners were more successful. A dozen MCR members with guests around the table in the Hearn Room, candlelight, and of course, witty conversation. What surprised me, and it should not have, since I guess it was the reason for setting up an MCR in the first place, was the amount of time I had to spend listening to members' personal concerns. Hardship, the solitude of postgraduate studies after the collectivity of undergraduate life, problems with research, problems with thesis, problems with supervisors. Once, and a window on the values of the time, I faced a really serious situation. A thoroughly depressed chap in the depths of despair asked my advice on what he had to get himself, on what he had to do to get himself elevated from the Greyhounds to the Blue Squad. Not you, mate. I sat on the college council, and I flattered myself that the principal treated me as a speaking partner. But of course I knew very well that he discussed the same things with the JCR president, with Cyril, his butler, and Philip, the hall porter. The last two probably knew more about what was going on in college than we did. The hall was poorly endowed financially, and this gave rise to a kind of quiet desperation on the principal's part. "The principal would like to see you, sir, if it's convenient," came the quiet and respectful voice of Cyril. I found John brandishing a letter addressed to him from the Independent Order of Foresters, stating that they had just discovered that their founder, Chief Orinateka, was the first Red Indian to study at Oxford. He had come to the hall 100 years previously, and they wished to make a presentation to commemorate the event. To the principal, that was a strong indication of financial support for the college. He resolved to put on a special lunch, though he considered that the college could not afford it. He ordered grouse. On the fateful day, a select and well-briefed band of us filing into the old dining hall noticed an easel with an object on it covered with a cloth. Is it one of those presentation checks? No, that's the wrong shape. After lunch, John spoke. Now, Nick commented on his distinctive voice. I always found it hard to believe that he was a fellow Scotsman, but John was also a wonderful orator. He built castles of words, lobbed in creative metaphors, and performed acrobatics of erudition. After lunch, he made a pretty loaded speech, golden links across the Atlantic, the story worthy of Mark Twain of a Native American among the dreaming spires, adamantine chains of shared values. One of the American guests followed with some relevant words and then unveiled a hidden object. It was a portrait of Chief Orinateka in full Mohawk dress. I do not know whether the foresters later donated funds to the college. I understand there is a room named after the chief. But that, for the moment, was that. After all the build-up, the principal was completely deflated, and he stammered a few words of gratitude. When I met him in the quad a few days later, he looked at me and he just shook his head. He had recovered his balance a few days later. John was always very kind to me and my girlfriend, now wife, Louise, and used to take us out to dinner. One Saturday evening, when we arrived at Il Saraceno, which was an Italian restaurant under the Odeon in Magdalen Street, we found him in a state of agitation. A bottle of champagne arrived, and the principal explained that some weeks previously, he had learned that Lord Wolfson was in the process of gifting a new building to a certain Oxford college. John had found a way to intercede on behalf of the hall and had managed to deflect the discussions. He had received confirmation that very afternoon from the Wolfson Foundation that the new building would in fact be at Teddy Hall. Floria Aula, he toasted. This is going to transform the future of the hall. And he was dead right, wasn't he? What the disappointed college thought of all this is not recorded. Who wins the match between now and then? We were, I think, the last generation of amateurs, expected to get involved in a range of academic and extramural activities. And at the call, of course, that meant sport, and that meant pressure to win. I shudder to think what it must have been like to hate sport and have been a student at this college. Soon after our time, the postgraduate academic world seemed to become more serious, more colonized, and greatly more competitive. I think it is truly admirable that the Hall tries to continue some of the old traditions. The board honouring those who gain a first and a blue. I just can't imagine how difficult that achievement must be in today's world. And by the founding of the Masterclass Fund, which actually widens the scope of those traditions. We were, or at least I was cut a lot of slack. I saw my supervisor twice a term, once to discuss my work, the other for him to sign my grant and expenses forms. Now, postgraduate work is managed by a comprehensive process of supervision, and for good reason, so that subjects are properly exploited and people do not fail. So many of my contemporaries just drifted along and away without a degree, or one that they completed a decade later. And we, or again at least I, had the joy of discovery. Nobody had touched my subject since the early 19th century, except for a Harvard thesis in the 1920s. And I used a wealth of primary source material, probably the first to have access to it. If you were to tackle the same subject today, you would have to elbow your way in and find either some new angle to the massive studies already done, or a hitherto undiscovered poem. Mind you, I'd have loved to have had the internet. I must have written to all the libraries in the Western world and visited many of them in the quest for material. But today, accommodation is better, the standard of food has been transformed, and this more pluralistic Oxford seems to me an altogether happier place than the one I encountered. So who wins? My conclusion is that it's a draw. I think our generation and the succeeding generations who have lived, worked, studied, and played in this college have all shared the equal privilege of being members of the warm, varied, and challenging society that continues to be Teddy Hall. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Nick. We now have Susan Anderson, who Susan must be applauded even before she gets to the lectern, because she's come all the way from Atlanta and she's brought her charming daughter with her. Susan?
It seems to me that what we've heard so far, some things in Teddy Hall don't change. When I came to Oxford in the 80s, it was still a place where sport ruled. 8th week was the culmination of the year's training, and there was always competition in Norham Gardens for the ergo machine. I don't even know if they have this contraption anymore and what they call it, but I came to Oxford to study English on the recommendation of my undergraduate mentors, one of my undergraduate mentors, Chris Armitage, who was himself an Aulerian. And I was pleased to learn, this thing keeps coming on, that the English tutors at the Hall enjoyed a strong faculty-wide reputation. And Aulerians still made themselves known as people who worked hard and played hard. I came from a very large university, the University of North Carolina, and will always remember how the MCR provided a closely knit little haven within the larger Oxford community. The MCR was the best place in the world to go to avoid writing a particularly stubborn tutorial essay, as there was always a friendly colleague to chat with. During a long session in the bod, one always looked for someone in the reading room to stop by one's table with a fancy a cup of tea. the excuse to slip off to the MCR for foursies. If you were lucky, you might make it back to the library to retrieve your belongings before it closed. Or if one were feeling less garrulous, one could always hide behind the newspaper of one's choice to eavesdrop on those who were feeling more talkative. By this time, we were, though, I think, a larger and increasingly diverse group than in previous decades. In addition to the Brits and the more run-of-the-mill North Americans, Australians, Europeans, South Africans among us, we could also boast of students from India, Pakistan, Ecuador, China, and Syria, to mention a few. This, coupled with the fact that paradigms in the world order really did seem to be changing, it made it a fantastic time to be at Oxford. My time in the MCR was bookended by the uprising at Tiananmen Square on one side and the fall of the Berlin Wall on the other. In these last days of the Cold War, I think we had the sense that anything was possible and that the world really was going to be a better place. We would only learn later, sadly, as recently as, yesterday, that we were trading one set of problems for another. My fellow MCR members continually challenge my assumptions, though. I always credit a Syrian woman named Amal Abdulmallah, who studied women in English modernism, with awakening the true feminist in me. An elfin young woman with an infectious laugh, she defied all the stereotypes handed down to me in America of Middle Eastern women. I've held on to my image of her all of these years, especially as the events after the turn of this century have unfolded. Speaking of women and feminism, I should mention that I do hold the distinction of being the first female MCR president. And I wish I could say that I was elected from an open-minded constituency, but really I was one of those ones who had her hand up and no one else did. And then I will say that there were some who said, wait, that's a woman, oh, I'll stand. What surprises me now is that there was anything surprising about this, but I came from a large state university in the US where just the previous year, the first female student body president had been elected, and women had been there a very long time. So Oxford, I know there were people who thought a woman should not do that job, but in practice, the whole thing went off without major incident. My important priorities during that time were to make sure that my name, when it was put on the president's board, did not have a miss before it. And that I would also get a pewter tankard to hang in the buttery with my name on it, and not some frilly little knick-knack. So I just want you to know that I have my priorities straight. There are so many people that I could mention who were important at this time, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our scout, who I think her title was later made the MCR Butler. Do you know the MCR Butler? But her name was Mrs. Kate Brown, and she worked tirelessly to make every single member in the MCR feel like the MCR was home. And I have to personally thank, she always had a cup of tea or a glass of sherry, but I have to personally thank her for introducing me to my husband of 25 years. I remember she told me, you know, there's another American here. I think you would like him. He's ever so nice. And I know I'm not the only one who owes her for a life partner. I'd love to hear from you sometime today if that's true for you. And also, I do have to interject that when my daughter was looking through my notes, she insisted that I tell you the story of Principal Kelly's Freshers' Breakfast. In the first week, as we all remember from being freshers, lots of things are going on. And in our pigeonholes, I was wondering, do you still have pigeonholes?
Yeah.
Even though I would think email would make that obsolete. But in our pigeonholes, we got beautifully engraved invitations to Principal Kelly's Freshers' Breakfast. Gather on the front quad at dawn. Fortunately for us, the night before the event, copies of the invitation were posted all over college with big red markings on it that said, hoax! And so it turned out that it had all been a scam, and no one ever found out who actually perpetuated this crime. Fortunately, so there didn't have to be a dean's intervention. But I did find out later that I had married this person. So since leaving the MCR, I have been grateful for things I took away. Friends who are still friends almost 30 years later, a sense of belonging to a group whose whole was greater than its parts, a network of professional connections, a greater ability to understand the perspective of others, and finally, the appreciation for a good pint of lager. Thanks.
Thank you. Now we have someone who George Osborne would describe as coming from the powerhouse of the North. And Juel from Manchester.
Okay, so I prepared very personal recollections of my time in Oxford, and I feel I might not be very representative, so if you want to add anything from the 90s, which I'm here to represent, then feel free. So my first foray to Oxford was a 6-month internship from École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and that was in 1993. And I discovered a citywide campus and a friendly and stimulating research environment. And this was a time of high unemployment in France in the early 90s, whereas I came to Oxford and I found none of the gloom that prevailed amongst all the French students at the time. And of course, with hindsight, things were not too bright in England either. You had a country governed by a conservative prime minister with a very small majority, which was beset by endless argument over the relationship with Europe. How very different from today. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. But to me, Oxford offered endless possibilities. So I got introduced to Teddy Hall MCR by my fellow physics graduate students. And in the lab, and it was a welcoming place to enjoy lunch and tea and coffee and conversation that was always catered for admirably by the legendary Mrs. Brown. Mrs. Brown actually retired in 1994, I believe, and was then replaced by Juel, who I was astonished to find has just retired yesterday. So yes. All these years, she has, basically remained in Oxford for all these years, and so despite ill health and much else. So the MCR was a social place. It was a place to read the papers, develop a social life. And most of all, what I really appreciated at Oxford was all the stimulating discussions with a very international group, which was enrolled in a multitude of disciplines that populated the MCR. And when I returned to Oxford a year later to study for DPhil, I of course applied to Teddy Hall and was granted a Miller Award, which covered purpose-built accommodation in Brocker's Lodge in Norham Gardens. And after years of commute from the suburbs as an undergraduate at Paris, I felt this was student life. It had finally started. So when I think back to the MCR, I'm ashamed to say I've suppressed all the juicy details, and I will give you the most sedate view of my time in the MCR. There were many juicy details, but I think it's not to be recalled in such a large audience. So I think of great social events, dinners, the legendary Burns night, far too much whiskey, wine tastings, whiskey tastings, again. Desserts night in the old dining hall, discussing great discussions in the buttery, and great friends I made during my time there, and a genuine feeling of intellectual freedom. And so for the undergraduates, the college is their home in Oxford, and the centre of the social, and the centre of the social life also, but also the centre of their work life. Whereas the difference for postgraduate, which is not possibly always appreciated, is that the lab or the research library is the centre of their work life. So for them, the college is a place of leisure. And the MCR was very much a place of leisure for us. And so I look back very fondly on my time in Teddy Hall MCR and my year as president. And I'm sure that following graduates have found the same freedom and happiness that I found here. So floor it out.
Next up is Jennifer Chung, who is travelled from one of the leafier suburbs of London, Twickenham.
Yes. Thanks. I actually don't live in Twickenham.
You don't live in Twickenham.
It's a little expensive, so I work there. So I actually prepared. I can feel you groaning. I actually prepared. Is this it? Oh, here it is. There we go. And let's play slideshows.
Just down there.
Okay. It's kind of like my summer holidays, my MCR. So I've chosen to give you a photographic tour of my time in the MCR. So I came here, I matriculated, I believe, in 2003 to do a master's in comparative international education. My supervisor was David Phillips, also a fellow of this hall, and I stayed on for a DPhil after that. I was struck by my colleagues here, by some of the words they said. Nick, growing up slowly, I quite like that. You'll see a lot of slow growing up in these pictures. Sport. When I said I was going to Teddy Hall, everyone said, do you play rugby or do you row? No, I don't do any of those things. So, but I did have many people tell me how Teddy Hall I am, with the exception of the athletics, because that's not me at all. The close-knit environment that we shared, and our beloved butler, Juel, who just retired yesterday. So I'll take you through a pictorial tour of my time at Teddy Hall. So here are just some of us dressed up for various events. We actually have a couple of MCR presidents in this picture as well. So this close-knit environment we had, I don't know what it's like now. There were always people in our MCR. 7 in the morning, 3 in the morning, obviously before, after dinner, before and after lunch, there are always people in the MCR. And I can tell you, my friends from other colleges thought that was very strange. Why are there people in your MCR? My friend from New College said, if I saw someone from the MCR asked if they were lost or ill, is something wrong? Why are you in the MCR? Some of the memories I have, you spoke about the newspapers. We had, I think my first year, we would sit together and try to do the crossword puzzle together. And then that started into, I just saw someone's head shaking. So maybe you still do that. We had a little foray into Sudoku when that became really cool. But lots of group activities with the newspapers. There was lots of debate as well in the MCR. Learning from all these people from different countries, having different perspectives. I think we all grew because of that. And generally just having some fun, cups of tea, and then in the evenings, something a bit stronger, obviously. And here we are. This is our garden party in the beautiful garden. It's been, I think, renovated since I took a walk through this afternoon. And since we said the deans are not here, I can tell a few stories. All those corks ended up somewhere. My first year, we were aiming them at Queen's College, trying to break the windows. And then the years afterwards, we're trying to see how many we could shoot over the wall into New College. Yes, this happens? Okay. Yeah. I've often thought maybe I should go to New College and see how many of our corks are lying around there. And so this is our MCR garden party, weather like today. So just lots of fun. Yes, this group mentality that we have together. I think we had a really especially close-knit group of people. And this is post Teddy Hall. None of these pictures were actually taken in this college. This very interesting picture we have in the corner of me and 3 young men. These guys were 4th years, actually, during my time when I was MCR president. There was a bit of debate whether we should have 4th years as part of the MCR. I'm not sure. There's nodding. I'm sure this debate has gone on for about 50 years. But look how well we get along. This is at the Oxford-Cambridge Club. I think this is at least 1 in the morning. And we decided to take a Teddy Hall picture. And so we all yelled Hall and snapped a picture. And then here we are. The memories will last forever. Because, yes, the memories were a bit vague at that point. But we have it. We have it there. And this is my friend's wedding, the top picture. And here we are doing Teddy Bear's picnic at the wedding. There's a lot of people from the MCR there. And then these 2 guys were best met at each other's wedding. So I thought that was really nice. So we can really see the continuation of these friendships. I mean, it's been, I think, 10 years since I was MCR president, but you said, for decades longer, these continue to last. MCR christenings are starting to happen. So, maybe we'll go to our children's weddings someday. So I just really wanted to show you how a relationship that began here in the MCR has really continued throughout the years. And I think also what's really special is the relationship I had with some of the fellows. I don't know how many linguists we have. This is Chris Wells, who is, for German and linguistics, and that's his wife Reinhild, who also lectured here. So he was my college advisor, separate from my supervisor, who was David Phillips, and he said, hey, we got a house in Crete. If you're ever in Crete, give me a call. So I did. So this is us having dinner at their house in Crete. So I thought this was something really special. This probably doesn't occur very often, but I found that even the relationships you have with the fellows was quite special. And speaking of which, this is Principal Gull's predecessor, Principal Mingo's. Apparently this would not happen in other colleges, snapping pictures with the president or warden or whatever you call them at different colleges. So I have here pictures with Principal Mingo's, and I have many memories of him. One of my favorites, I was at high table. He just turned to me and said, Jennifer, do you find David Beckham attractive? I thought, it's one of the stranger questions I've ever been asked at high table. I said, yeah, he's handsome. He said, long hair or short hair? I don't remember what the answer was. It's kind of, perhaps both, maybe not the sarong, but this is, I think, apparently never would happen in other colleges. I married a Martonian, actually, and this, he said, would never happen there. Sorry about that. I think I don't have the Teddy Hall power couple that we have here. So I would say, let's keep it there for a second. So these words I've heard from the previous decades, the growing up slowly, which we've definitely seen. The sport, no, not quite there. The close-knit environment that we've shared, so we definitely see these common threads. Learning from each other. Working hard and playing hard, I think, is a definite theme that we've carried through in my time. I would also like to say how generous I thought the MCR was and the college was with us. All our events were free, no cost to any of the MCR members. And that, as I understood, my time as MCR president did not happen in other colleges. Even colleges that were rich and had tons of money, they always charged for their events. We never did. I remember one May morning, word got out and there was some ridiculous queue of interlopers trying to get into our MCR for May morning. And since we're nice, we let them come in. But just like to say this, the great community spirit that it fostered. Perhaps we're not the richest college. Perhaps we are not so rich because we are so kind and generous to our members. Which also adds, I'm sure, to the working hard and playing hard that we did. And then, so where did Teddy Hall get me for the future? This is me looking younger. This is my master's graduation. That's my DPhil with St. Edmund out there. You can say all these. Obviously, the academic aspect helps, but I would also say what sticks out in my mind, they began these senior common room lectures for MCR members. I'm not sure if they carried through, but we all had a chance to present our research to other members of the MCR and the SCR, just as practice. I remember it was the first presentation I ever did, and I was completely freaking out, and I probably prepared too much content and lots of words, which I've learned since then not to do. So I'm a lecturer as a profession, so that really helped me prepare. I think also being on the MCR committee, all these things you write in your covering letter, leadership skills, collaboration skills, working in a team, all those things. And I think also just being in an environment with people from around the world that challenge you was something you can't really put a price tag on or learn in the library for that matter. So I'd just like to sum up. I think of this place extremely fondly. I had a wonderful time, and I'm very happy to be back. So my husband isn't here, so yes, he was a Mertonian, and I don't think he had this much fun. And we have a baby, so I'm trying to perhaps have him soak up some of the environment, so he decides to come here in the future instead of other places. Right, thank you.
Thanks, Gemma. Now, keeping the theme of well-travelled presenters, we've had Atlanta, we've had Manchester, and now sparing little expense, Charlotte Cooper, who's still here.
Yes, all the way from the depths of the Abingdon Road this morning. Thanks, Keith. When I was elected MCR President back in 2013, I was very surprised at the number of people who asked me whether I was the first female president. And I thought, what an odd question to ask in 2013. And isn't it sad that people think I might be the first female president? And I was asked this quite a lot, actually. So it's really delightful to have met the woman who was the first female president all the way back in the 80s. So yay for Teddy Hall. When I first arrived here, I was very surprised and sort of relieved that nobody I met in the MCR had put Teddy Hall, shamefully, as their college of preference, which included myself. I just ticked the I don't really care where I go box. And I think that's something that really makes the MCR here quite unique, actually, is that people who arrive, that's often the way, and people who come here haven't wanted Christchurch. They haven't wanted Magdalen. They're not bothered if they don't have a portrait of Henry VIII looming over them in the dining hall, or don't have a deer park to go foray in. We just sort of want a nice Oxford experience. I think we're just happy to be here. But we also don't want a graduate-only college. We want to feel part of the community and to be involved with the undergrads, controversially as well. But what I thought I'd talk about today is the fact that every year there is a very different feel or flavour in the MCR, and this is partly down to the fact that the people that make up our common room are so very different every year, and the experiences of everyone involved in it are constantly changing themselves. So I think anyone who spent more than a year in the MCR will have a very distinct impression and memory of what each year has been like. But no matter what the flavour of a particular year has been, when I think back over my time in the MCR, there are 3 B's that come to mind. And these are baking, bears, and booze. The less that's said about the latter, perhaps the better. Although even at boozy events, we've always maintained a certain amount of class and sophistication. And as for baking, over the last few years, it's become a truth universally acknowledged in the MCR that no problem, however large or small, cannot be solved with cake. And so we've been holding for some time a weekly cake morning, which has recently been given a competitive edge and rebranded as the Great Teddy Hall MCR Bake Off. And the annual cake and cocktails party, which was originally added to the term card by Tom Hopkins, who was steward in 2012. And he added this event in honour of his own birthday. But it's now a very firm favourite on the MCR calendar. I think when I organised this a couple of years ago, we spent over £200 on cake. So it's a good event. But the biggest celebrity around here in recent years has certainly been Sebastian the Bear. And Sebastian arrived in the MCR in 2012, although I should say he's not actually ours. He was won by a friend of a member of the MCR who couldn't take it back home, and so left it to Julian, who was a member here. And when he left the MCR and went back to Brazil last year, the bear just stayed on. Unfortunately, we haven't always done too well in looking after him. and he's been kidnapped, as far as I'm aware, I think 4 times. The first time he was taken by Trinity College during an exchange dinner, and on our return leg of the dinner, to our great relief, we found that he was sitting at the head of the table waiting for us. A couple of months after that, he was held hostage by Christchurch for over a month. But it wasn't all bad, and they even took him on a mini trip to Paris, which made headlines. Next came Pembroke, and I think there was another kidnapping earlier this year, but I don't think that lasted too long, so it wasn't as exciting as this. But all this doesn't mean that we're not still a very serious bunch. This is the game of drinking Jenga, and I'll be happy to explain the rules later, but it's a particular MCR party favourite. And over recent years, the MCR committee has been working very hard for us to be taken seriously and integrated academically into some of the activities in college. So yes, we still have a termly graduate seminar, and we've been organising a few more academic type of events, and all this came to a head with the Research Expo that took place earlier this year. But it's the silly little things that make the MCR a place that helps people to pull through. And I've had a lot of conversations with people recently about whether the academic climate is bleaker now than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. And it's hard to say. I think we're all facing different pressures at different times. And I don't know many people who haven't suffered from some sort of physical or mental health issues, or breakups and relationship problems, or just suffering with the strain of writing their thesis and all the problems that come with that, or exams and rejection. These are all part of the fun side of academia. But this, I think, for me, is what the MCR has really come to represent. And very few people leave here without having formed a Teddy Hall family. And I'm always surprised how often I hear people referring to the group of friends that they've made here in those terms. And it's the support that each of us forms here that really helps us to keep our heads above water as we go through this challenging stage in our academic lives. And that's the flavour that I think stays the same every year. It's already come up a couple of times, but this is a photo from yesterday, and this was Julie's retirement party that we threw for her in the MCR, and I know that she's also been a real part of that family, and we all wish her the very best. Thank you.